Thank you again for participating in Seminary on Sunday. It's a unique concept, and we're grateful. And in this time of, and I'm going to pronounce it incorrectly on purpose, in this time of the pandemic, we are taking advantage of it to grow and to develop. The worst thing you can do in this time is lose your edge, or lose your focus, and stop being a student. And so we wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to bring together some of the greatest minds in the country as it relates to preaching. And I think, to me, the dean of teaching preachers to preach is with us today. I met this man years ago, and his preaching style, his message, his therapeutic approach resonated with me because I saw in him what I was attempting to do and be in terms of messaging. And years ago, I used to do a preaching conference called the Preaching Institute, and he came and he did a message that was so phenomenal until it literally made me rethink aspects of my life and made me rethink preaching in very real ways. And so Dr. Frank Thomas, who leads the only program, I think, in the country and maybe the world as it relates to a PhD in African American preaching, is here. And he's going to take this next hour or so to expand us and grow us. And I'm excited to introduce to some, and as the old folks say, present to others, the incomparable Dr. Frank Thomas. Please, everybody, mute your phones and mute your gadgets and open your hearts. This is going to be an amazing hour. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. John Guns, for, first of all, the gracious invitation, and then the quality of our relationship across the years, and then thirdly, your own preaching prowess. It's a great honor for me to spend this time and to really discuss a subject that I'm tremendously passionate about, as I would imagine that anybody that takes a Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock and is watching this Zoom call about preaching is also very passionate. And so when you get people who are passionate about the same subject, I've never seen anything but sparks happen when I, for example, interview people. They love preaching and I love preaching. And so let me mention that quickly. On YouTube, I have a series where I interview preachers. You can watch it on my YouTube channel. I have one particularly, if you're more interested, after you hear any of this, and you're interested in hearing about what I think about preaching more in depth. At the end, I'm going to talk to you about reading resources. But in the beginning, there's an interview that Dr. Gina Stewart did with me, where I talk about great depth and in detail. I think that, yes, there it is. I just put it in the chat so you can look at that. Let me begin by saying to you how I really became to fall in love with Black preaching. I was a junior in college, and I was at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. We had a friend of mine who was killed in a botched shoe store robbery. And he had a part-time position, was going to school during the day and working at night in Tom McCann, and was shot and killed. And so on 83rd and Damon in Chicago, where the Reverend L.K. Curry was the pastor, the family was a member of that congregation. And so I sat with a room full of young people, distraught, really, really hopeless and pained, absolutely upset. And Dr. L.K. Curry got up and preached. And I don't know quite what he did, but when he got through, I felt better. When he got through, I had hope. So I began for the first time to pay tremendous attention to African American preaching, because I kept saying, how do you do that? How do you take a room full of people who are distraught at losing a friend, a brother, to a tragic death, and the room has hope when the preacher finished? Now, I know it's God. I know it's the power of the Word and the power of the Holy Spirit. But there's also something about a particular vessel and a particular instrument through whom God moves and God uses. So I had that question just sticking in me about this African American preaching. Um, I went to a Lutheran church, then a United Methodist church, and I had some samplings of African American preaching, but never like this. I mean, I can't tell you what he preached because that's been 30 something years, but I can tell you that he preached, and that preaching lit a spark in me. So to make a long story short, I ended up in seminary. I was in seminary. This would be ancient of days to many of y'all. I graduated seminary in 1981, and I began pastoring my first church in 1982. So in the seminary, they did not have a preaching class, an African American preaching class, and preaching was optional. You didn't have to take it if you didn't want to. So I really hadn't taken a preaching class, and here I am as a pastor preaching every Sunday. And I might add, to many of us, I may say that when I first started preaching, my leg would shake. And so I would take this right hand and hold my leg and then take this other hand. And I'd only have one hand for expression because my legs were shaking. So people say, I started preaching, I'm shaking like a leaf. Well, it's all of us. Don't look at the finished product. Don't look at me standing up there like I'm confident and I'm smooth right now. My beginnings are nervousness and still, nervous about it. So at any rate, I tried to get better as a preacher. I needed to get better. So I picked up a book by Henry H. Mitchell, called The Recovery of Preaching. I picked that book up and I read it and I adopted his preaching style. It's called the celebrative preaching style. It just made sense to me. And so I began to practice this celebrative preaching style. So I've been preaching in this style for almost 36 years. It has been tremendously rewarding. In 1989, I did a DMin with Dr. Henry Mitchell, and I ended up writing my thesis on celebration, and my thesis became published as my first book called They Like to Never Quit Praising God, The Role of Celebration in Preaching. So for almost 36 years now, I've been preaching in this style. I've been experimenting with it. I've had some great victories. I've had some stinging defeats. But what I'm suggesting that if you want to get better in preaching, that we must practice the fundamentals. So I have a saying. I say that bad preaching is not a sickness unto death. Bad preaching can be fixed. When I hear bad preaching, what I experience is people are missing one or two, they're missing the fundamentals. What are the fundamentals? Well, let me give you an example. If anybody's a musician, which I'm sure that we have some people here who are musicians, when you first start taking music lessons or learning to play an instrument, the first thing they teach you is what? Scales. You have to learn the scales. And I don't care how proficient you get at music, you can be the greatest pianist, you can be playing, with Kurt Carr, or you can be a classical pianist. What is certainly still sure is that you're still playing the scales. You're still in the fingering. There's some places you can't reach on the piano without the basic fundamentals. What I tell people is that preaching has fundamentals. And if you miss the fundamentals, your preaching suffers. So to get better, we have to keep practicing and practicing and practicing the fundamentals. The fundamentals of my style, I preach in a narrative form. There are different styles, different forms. Expository is real hot and real popular right now. I preach in a narrative form. And so preaching in a narrative form, I have some fundamentals that I teach. And there's 6 of them I want to share with you. They'll be very brief and they'll be very quick. The first fundamental of preaching for me in my narrative celebrated preaching style is, number one, you must know what you believe, what I call core belief. What is it that you most deeply believe about the character of God? What is the essence of God's character? Some people will say God is love. Some people will say God is faithful. Some people will say God is present. But to find out for yourself what for you is the essence of God's character. I learned this in a very difficult time of trial and tribulation. I didn't learn this sitting around reflecting and writing in a very quiet room. I was in the middle of a major piece of church conflict, and the conflict was public. And people around the city, based upon it being in the news and on television, came to see what I was going to preach because basically several members of the church sued me and the church leadership. But don't worry about it. I'm the preacher on Sunday. So what am I going to preach? Well, I went through a series of thoughts about it. Well, number one, I can call my great friend John Guns to come and preach for me on Sunday, but that would be chickening out. Then I said, well, I can preach, ye whitewashed tombs, ye workers of iniquity. I can preach about them and against them. And then when they say, you preaching about us, you say, well, I'll just preach in the text. Well, that's avoidance and that's mean-spirited. Plus, it doesn't help people. And then along about Thursday, I think it was God said to me, preach what you most deeply believe about my character. When you're in trouble, preach what you most deeply believe about the character of God. You know what I believe about God? That God is merciful and a compassionate God. I preached that, and they were waiting for a fight sermon. It was crazy. I got up and preached, our God is so full of compassion and mercy. I preached the gospel. So, but you only come to know that through trial and tribulation. What is it that you most deeply believe about the character of God? You have to preach what you most deeply believe about the character of God. Give you one quick example, and then I'll keep moving. So, Fred Price, Dr. Fred Price was very popular through the 80s and the 90s. And whenever you turned on his broadcast, you were going to hear something about faith. The name of the broadcast was Ever Increasing Faith, because he believed that faith, that God was faithful, and that if you demonstrated faith, because that was his core belief. Let me get to number two. I call it universal human experience. I'm going to give you a workbook where I've outlined all this in that you can get it if it's really interesting to you. Number two is a universal human experience. When I say universal human experience, what I mean is I don't target sermons to boomers, Xers, millennials, and all of that. What I do is preach universal human experience, which is guilt. I mean, everybody has an experience of guilt. So you got parents who are sitting out there who made some mistakes raising their children, they're guilty. You've got young adults who are in conflicted relationships, and some they messed up. Everybody, regardless of race, nation, place, or, is going to preach guilt. Dr. Susan Smith, one of my friends from from Columbus, Ohio, did a sermon ages ago on guilt. And because she's a reader, she started the sermon with Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, where a person got completely away with the crime, but the guilt ate at him. The guilt ate him alive, so he confessed the crime. The text for the sermon was, and Judas hung himself. That was the text. And she preached, talked about Judas, talked about the guilt. So she moved from Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky, she moved to talk about Judas, the guilt. This has been 30 years, I remember it. She talked about, how guilt can get in and how guilt can get you to think that God won't even forgive you, so your life is worthless. So you may as well hang yourself. And this, y'all, is the title of the sermon. She called it "Cut Down the Noose." She said, in your life, there's guilt. And if you let it, it will ruin your life and run your life. And you'll do what Judas did. But cut down. The grace of God is that you can be forgiven. So you can be a PhD, you can be a no D, you can be, a millionaire, and you can be waiting for the check to come in the mailbox from the government. Guilt is human experience. So what I try to preach is universal human experience. So when I'm preaching, I got to worry about millennials and Xers and, the boomers, and I don't waste a lot of time with that. I preach universal human experience. Let me get to number 3, because I don't want to go too long. Number 3 is sense appeal or experiential preaching. You want people to experience your preaching. So when you stir senses, so let's take everybody knows the 23rd Psalm. How many images? The Lord is my shepherd. Shepherd is the first image. I shall not want. Maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Prepare us a table before me. You can see it. You can experience it. So the process works. This is very quick because you can get it through the workbook, is that when you stir images, when you preach images, it stirs the sense. It creates identification. When identification is created, emotion is released. When emotion is released, the body registers it as interest, and people are open to listen. You can get more of that in the workbook. But these are fundamentals. These are fundamentals that I'm practicing. I'm always working on core belief. What is it that I most deeply believe about God? I'm always working on universal human experience. I'm always working on sense appeal. Number 4, and I call structure, structure, structure. How do you structure a message? When your structure is bad, you're hard to listen to. When you're all over the place, people will exit mentally the message and wait till you get to your hoop to come back in, because you're not making it easy for them to follow you. So structure allows people to follow you in a very easy format. So the structure that I use is situation. There's some situation. There's a complication of the situation. There's a resolution in the gospel text. The word of God is the resolution. And then we celebrate the resolution. So that's situation, complication, resolution. I structure and celebration. I structure my messages. I find that many messages are unstructured. They're all over the place. So people are preaching 2 and 3 scriptures. They're not preaching 1 scripture. They're not focused. So I believe that structure, that people can leave only with 1 central idea. Now, you might, in your preaching, turn a prism where a different angle of that 1 idea is visible. But you had better, for sure, stay to 1 idea. People get too many ideas. And then I'll say this parenthetically. One of the sins of preaching in the Black church is over illustration. It's too many illustrations. It makes the sermon long. And because there are so many illustrations, and we love them. I mean, the people are rocking and rolling, the preacher's rocking and rolling, everybody's enjoying it and having fun. The danger of too many illustrations is people are left with your illustration and they miss the main central message. The sermons can be too long, and often I've seen it, I've taught preaching a long time. We have to illustrate, we have to illustrate, we have to illustrate, too many illustrations. That was just parenthetic. Then I do something called a preaching worksheet. I have a worksheet that I go through. I ask myself some fundamental questions about, I do my research, I do my homework, I have my prayer, I do a bunch of just getting ready. And then I go to this worksheet and I answer these 6 questions. I won't go through them. It's in the workbook. I go through the 6 questions. I write out all the answers. And after I write all the answers, I know my structure. And then the last one I say is celebration. So Henry Mitchell and I developed some quote unquote rules of celebration. For example, you cannot celebrate what people do wrong. You can only celebrate what people do right or are getting ready to do right or the change in their lives. Celebration also is around the great themes of the Bible: mercy, justice, love, truth, beauty, healing, grace, forgiveness. Great sermons are about the great themes of the Bible. I had an uncle once, when he found out I was a seminary graduate, he had graduated from Bible college. And since I was supposed to be a highfalutin seminary graduate, not that I acted that way, but anyway, he decided that he was going to give me a Bible question to see how much Bible knowledge I really knew. So he asked me this. He said, how many jewels are in Melchizedek's crown? And then stepped back with a fierce grin, like he never expected me to be able to answer that question. How many jewels are in Melchizedek's crown? Well, I didn't know that. And why is that relevant? With all of the big questions about mercy and justice and love and peace and forgiveness, that, we got to have a sermon that's big enough, that the idea is worthy enough. Now, how many, I guess you could take the number of crowns in Melchizedek, number of Jews in Melchizedek's crown and do something creative, but he just wanted to prove. And I'm like, is this a great theme of the Bible? Are we contending for the faith by knowing the number of jewels in Melchizedek's crown? So, my point being that you have to preach the great themes of the Bible. And, and there's more of them. I won't go into all of them. I just wanted to say to you all that if you have a setup, what are your fundamentals of preaching? What's your preaching method? What's your fundamentals? Do you practice your fundamentals? That's just like scales. I can tell you what my fundamentals are, and I hope that you would like to pick those up. I'd be happy about that. Those are the fundamentals that I think about. So I'm always, I'm always looking at, okay, what's my core belief? I'm always looking at, where's the universal human experience? I'm always looking at, where's the sense appeal and images? I'm always looking at, how's your structure? I'm always looking at, get your preaching worksheet. Don't get up there and you haven't prepared and planned and worked through some stuff about what is this sermon really about, and then what's my celebration. All of that is planned, though God does tend to change. I just think God has more to work with when you file a flight plan and then change in midair versus leaving the air with no plan, trusting for God to help you to land. So I think that everyone should have a method, and I think that you should understand what the fundamentals of those methods are. And there are a lot of different methods out here. Expository preaching is a method. Samuel DeWitt Proctor has a method: thesis, antithesis, relevant question, and synthesis. There are various, Lisa Thompson in her book Ingenuity, for all the women preachers, and not just for women preachers, but everybody, find a method that works for you. What's your method? If you get an opportunity to hear Dr. Gina Stewart preach, and you get a chance to go to lunch with her, or afterwards, sometimes she meets with folks, or have an opportunity, then ask her, what is your method? How do you do what you do? Because there's a method behind what she's doing, and that helps to you improve. I'm not suggesting that some of the questions are not worthy that you might want to ask her, but one thing I'm sure going to ask anybody that I get a chance: tell me about your method. Tell me about how you prepare a sermon. Tell me some of the best times that you were preaching. Tell me when it didn't really go well, and how did you feel about it, and what happened? These are the questions of students of preaching, I know, are to be asking, because the goal is to grow in your preaching. That's the goal. So what's your method? And maybe you have a hybrid method, but this I can guarantee you: if you define a method, and it's a solid method with good fundamentals, and you practice those fundamentals, you will get better. As a matter of fact, some of the best preachers in the country, they make it look easy. Some of them stand up there with a little Bible about this size, and it looks like they're just doing it off the top of their head. No, they're not doing it off the top of their head. There's some deep and profound work, even maybe a manuscript in the back that they have committed to memory. And let me give you another tip. This is just, I remember the first time I heard Dr. Gardner and Calvin Taylor preach. I was a pastor in my first 2 years, and the seminary invited him. He came and preached. And I mean, he rocked the place. And then I compared my average Sunday morning sermon to what he was doing. And I wanted to quit preaching because the gap was so wide. What I didn't know is that wasn't his first time preaching that sermon. He had preached that sermon many times and had been able to refine it, to polish it, to work on it, to get it deeper and better. And my average Sunday morning sermon as a pastor is a first run. You know, I write it during the week and I get up and preach it. So I've learned that when you hear these polished sermons, to ask the deeper questions. Sometimes, Doc, tell me, how long you been working on that sermon? Because most preachers are preaching what we call road dogs. You know, most folks ain't preaching new material, not all the time, but most folks are not preaching new material. So anyway, that's from the fundamentals of preaching. What are your fundamentals of preaching? That's a central question that I would raise with you all if you're going to get better. And fundamentals last the test of time. Fundamentals work in the era of COVID, and they work when there is no COVID. Fundamentals work at a revival, and they also work on Sunday morning. Fundamentals work if you're the guest preacher. Fundamentals work if you're the pastor. Fundamentals work if you're young, if you're old, if you're male, if you're female, if you're black, you're white. The fundamentals will stand. Every musician plays scales. I don't care who they are and how high they rise or how humble their origins, they still playing scales. Likewise, what they don't tell us is preaching has fundamentals. Now, I want to make another point I want to suggest to you is that what I call the African American preaching tradition. There is a very sophisticated argument that is made in theological circles about the creation. The argument is this: did God create ex nihilo, out of nothing? Or did God create from matter? Was there matter and God shaped matter? So they go to the Genesis, and the Spirit of the Lord moved over the face of the deep, and there's this huge that God created out of nothing. Or did God create the world out of matter? I say to you that if you're on this line, you come out of a preaching tradition. And that preaching tradition is the matter. You do not create sermons ex nihilo. And I'm going to use in particular an African-American preacher, African-American preaching. If you grew up hearing African-American preaching and you start preaching, that you got matter. It's been passed on to you. What bothers me is when people get up and start thinking they're saying something new. So for example, Romans 8:28. Romans 8:28 has been preached for 2,000 years. For you to get up and say that you're saying something new means that you're not in touch with the tradition. It's probably been preached for 400 years in the African American church. So how can you get up and preach and you don't know the tradition or you don't know the matter? You don't create sermons ex nihilo. You create sermons out of matter that we have been passed on this tradition. This is a great preaching tradition. I mean, we have had some preachers, you know, Zora Neale Hurston, for example, she was a folklorist, and she went down in Florida and recorded some of the sermons of folk preachers, you know, down in Florida. I think it's E-A-U Gaile, G-A-I, something like G-A-I-L-E. You know, I'm messing it up, but she's from Florida. So in one of her books, Jonah's Vine Gourd, she put the sermon in the book. A New York Times, a white book reviewer reviewed that book and said about the sermon that it was impossible that one preacher could demonstrate this level of genius in poetry, that this had to be a mixture of preachers. She wrote back and said, it's one preacher. And I know hundreds of preachers who are reaching this level weekly with their sermons. This is what we come from. It bothers me that we don't know that we come from that, right? So let me give an example. I give you another example. I never heard of J.M. Gates. You need to Google J.M. Gates. Before Martin Luther King Jr., J.M. Gates was the biggest funeral in Atlanta. J.M. Gates in 1926 put sermons on 78 records. He brought he brought his deacon, his choir member with him, and they're doing call and response, and he preaches only like 3 minutes or something. And he was the precursor to C.L. Franklin. C.L. Franklin, we know, sold records and traveled. J.M. Gates, C.L. Franklin listened to J.M. Gates. This is part of our history. This is part of our tradition. And so to get up and be ignorant of the tradition. So if you're interested, there's a book called Preaching with Sacred Fire. It's hard to find now. It's out of print and it's expensive, but it's worth it because Martha Simmons and I chronicle 103 sermons from the Black church, and you'll find, I mean, powerful sermons of all styles. You'll find hoopers and non-hoopers. You'll find, you know, we span the gamut, male, female, of the preaching tradition. So just know this has been passed on to you, and it's our job to pass it on, to allow it to live by passing it on the next generation. All right, so let me talk about some of the thoughts and feelings that I have. I've been talking for a straight half hour, so I'll talk 10 more minutes, and then we'll open up for some dialogue together. One of the things that I'm really concerned about in preaching, I call it intellectual sloppiness. That you're intellectually sloppy. People are sitting there with iPhones and iPads. So when your facts aren't straight, guess what? They check you out. So I think that we have, when I say intellectual sloppiness, that I remember the first time that I was invited back to preach at my seminary from which I graduated. I had these people who taught me, my professors, and Hebrew Bible, I mean, my New Testament professor, my church history professor, they all sitting there, and I'm getting ready to preach. Because I'm not intellectually sloppy on a regular basis, I didn't have to adjust much, though I did a little bit, to make sure my stuff was tight. Because you never know who's sitting in the audience. I preached in the Duke Chapel, and I was preaching from an Old Testament text. And after I finished, a woman introduced me as the professor of Hebrew Bible at Duke Divinity School. My first question was, how did I do with the text? She said, you were solid. So you can't be intellectually sloppy. You've got to do the work. And if you're intellectually sloppy, it's going to bite you because people are going to fact check it. They are going to fact check it. So let me give you the synopsis of how do I say this, some of the ways that I think about it. One of the questions that I ask myself about my preaching is, can I preach this at my mother's funeral? My dad's funeral. In all likelihood, if the family would so choose, I think I'd be willing to do it. And get your miracle, get your breakthrough, get your blessing. Ain't gonna fly at my mother's funeral. I got to have a word for myself and for the people. So rather than preach sloppy or preach cliches or dazzle the people with cotton candy, I want to give a substantive word. So my muscle is already built. that when it comes time that a truly profound and deep word is needed, I've already built the muscle. This is what I do every Sunday. So it's not that, I got to shift gears because I can't preach, get your miracle, get your breakthrough, get your blessing at the homegoing service of my mother. I'm probably going to have to preach the resurrection. I'm going to have to preach something that's solid, that's sound, that's based in something. And what I worry about is I hear a lot of cotton candy. I hear a lot of skimming the surface to get away, and which brings me to reflect on something that I'm working on. That I think that people have delivery gifts and people have content gifts, and that this will be the last thing, and then we'll open up for questions. People who have delivery gifts can preach the phone book, and people get excited. They just have delivery gifts. They can deliver it. I mean, they excite people. I mean, they got delivery gifts. Other people have content gifts. So let me give an example of content gifts. When I was growing up, they used to have submarines who used to be way underneath the water. If you watch the Navy movies and all that kind of stuff, the submarine is trying to be real quiet so that the sonar doesn't pick it up upstairs where the ship is. So what the ship would do once it picked up the signal from the submarine way down in the water, it would drop a depth charge, which means that's a bomb that goes down, 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 down. And when it just hits right above the ship, it explodes. People who have content gifts, they're dropping depth on people. And they have to be willing to wait until the explosion happens and people get it. So God tends to give some people delivery gifts, some people word gifts or content gifts. So I say, what God is trying to do, if God gives you a delivery gift, God is trying to get you to the middle to develop your word gifts to match it, because you can get by on charisma. You can get by on showwomanship or showmanship. You can get by on that. But God is pushing you to deepen that word. If God gives you a word gift and say, I don't want to be showy, I don't want to show, God is pushing you to the other side to release your delivery gift so you can be natural. Not that you have to be showy, but at least be natural. So what God wants is a content-based delivery gift, or a delivery gift that's content-based. God wants both. And most of us get one or the other. So for myself, I think I'm on the word and the content side. And I had to learn to relax because I wasn't a hooper. And I had to learn to relax because I didn't sing. I had to learn to relax because I didn't have a booming voice, but I had content. And so what I've tried to do across the years is develop my content and release my delivery gift rather than be uptight. So if you're not uptight about it, it's an asset. The only way it becomes a liability is if you're uptight about it. I'm a woman, I'm uptight about that. Then that's a liability. If you're a woman and you had the opportunity to preach and that's not a liability, it's an asset, boom, come out here and preach. So not just, gender, but all of us have all kind of liabilities. I keep talking about Dr. Gina Stewart because we have such a wonderful relationship. She's just great. We're great friends. And I call her a daughter of thunder. And I said, Gina, I would love to boom and thunder like you do. I would love to preach like that. God, you just boom and you thunder. You are a daughter of thunder. And then she says to me stuff like, well, Frank, I wish I could just sit there and talk quiet and make people shout without raising my voice. I'd like to do that. So God gives each of us a gift. And if you see your gift as an asset, you can work with it versus comparing yourself to preach like somebody else because, Martha Simmons says all of us would be hoopers if we could because, hoopers have a cannon. They close at the end. Well, that's true, but also it can have no content. So also it can erase the sermon. Also, only thing people left with is with the hooping. So I think that God gives everybody a gift. My goal is to stop talking at 3:40 or 3:39. I'm very close to stop talking. Is to give everybody a gift. And if you don't think your gift is a liability, it's an asset. So release your gift. All right, with that, I will stop. And if there are any questions that you would like to comment on, or you can put them in the chat. I think I'm looking at the chat. We've got notes in the chat. So maybe what I'll do while we're getting our questions typed is let me share the screen and let me go to this is the workbook that I was talking about the fundamentals of preaching in right here. You can order that on Amazon. Like I was talking about core belief, universal human experience, sense appeal, structure, situation, complication, all that stuff. As a part of this workbook, there are digital files that go with it. So which means my class lectures are in the back of the book. You get a download digital code, you download them. You got all my lectures, you work through my lectures, you work through the workbook. It's kind of a, I say it's a $2,500 seminary course for 30 bucks is what it is. And you can get that on Amazon. Since I'm in books, let me keep going while we're getting questions. I have a book entitled How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon, and I didn't talk much about that today, but it's available again on Amazon. It's a fascinating and a wonderful piece of work. It was so powerful that I think that you can't preach a dangerous sermon every Sunday, but every now and then you had better preach something that's dangerous. You know, that's it. Preaching it every Sunday is like never preaching it. You ought to preach something that challenges the people, you know, that raises critical issues, that challenges the status quo, you know. So I talk about that in that book. It was so successful that we just released a sequel. Oh, let me see. Can y'all see that? Not yet, huh? Hold on a second. It's called Surviving a Dangerous Sermon. This came out about 3 weeks ago. You can see it there. You know, some people said, Pastor, I want to preach a dangerous sermon. How do I survive it? So I lay out how in the world to survive a dangerous sermon. And one more, and then I'm going right to questions. And if you're interested in my discussion about the African-American preaching tradition, I talk here about the intro to the practice of African-American preaching. And a lot of the stuff I said about Zora Neale Hurston is in there, in that book, and this African-American preaching tradition that we have received, you know, that's there. Okay, those are resources for you. Don't forget my YouTube channel. I posted to you an interview for you. And on my YouTube channel, there's a whole bunch of stuff, sermons, interviews, just tons and tons of stuff that you can view. All right, so let me get out of this. And matter of fact, one more thing. Let me show you. I think I can. This is the interview on YouTube. This is a conversation with Reverend Dr. Frank, hosted by Dr. Gina M. Stewart. You can watch that if you're interested in me talking more about what I think about preaching. All right, let me stop share, and I am back to you all with what's my definition of a dangerous sermon. There are sermons that upset the status quo. That in America, there is a hierarchy. And the hierarchy is rich white males are at the top. Marginalized black, brown people, same-sex people, immigrants are at the bottom. So when you speak on behalf of the bottom people to address the top people, the sermon gets dangerous. Or every church has a hierarchy, right? For many churches, the men are at the top, you know, women at the bottom, and you get up to preach a sermon, you upset the status quo, it gets dangerous. When you preach and speak for the bottom to the top, it gets dangerous. And that's what, in essence, the short version of what some of the present challenges facing today's preacher and preaching. I think One of the biggest challenges I've been seeing is that people are trying to get used to not having an audience. That is one thing when you got people in the room and, it's rocking and rolling and we're doing call and response, the choir's there, you're there. But here now, it's 5 or 6 people and sometimes just one person. So how do I handle the call and response? So I keep saying you have to bring your own fire. That this is one of the biggest changes, that you have to bring your own fire. One of the biggest changes is that when you're not preaching to the masses, and we don't quite know when, even though these people are opening up some of these places, we're not sure when we're going to gather again. So that's one. I think if you're preaching online, eventually we're going to have to come to sermon talk back. So people need to talk back to you. It can't be one way. So do you have a chat? Some people say, hey, I get a chat here, and then somebody will watch the chat, or I'll preach the sermon, and then we'll have a talk back time where we can do dialogue. I think we're going there. I also suspect that sermons have to be shorter. That a 55-minute sermon, though people are doing it, I just wonder if people get screen tired, and they get the more screen tired they get, the shorter the sermon has to be. I'm just wondering about that. I'm also wondering about how in the world do we do fellowship so that the internet streaming service is not just one way. So I had an experience with Gary V. Simpson at Concord this morning. I watched him, and for the fellowship hour, I had a fellowship moment in the service, where people shake hands. They put people in chat rooms, and you could talk in the chat with people in the congregation. They divided everybody online, and I was a guest, I was a visitor, and they put me in a chat room. So, where normally I walk around and shake hands and hug, and I'm saying, hey, y'all, how you doing? My name is Frank Thomas. I'm visiting this morning. It's good to be with you all. So we have a wonderful pastor. Do you like our pastor? Oh, yes, I do. I know your pastor very well. I love him deeply, but, that's neither here nor there. My comment is these challenges are, and you need content. People are not going for the fluff. Get your miracle, get your breakthrough, get your blessing. I'm not sure. People are losing family members. People are scared they're going to get COVID. People are losing jobs. In 2008, Dr. Charles Edward Booth, when Lehman Brothers closed, the night Lehman Brothers closed, which locked the credit markets all over the world, and nobody was really sure about that next Monday morning, Charles Edward Booth called me up and said this, Frank, preaching is back in style. He had a saying, and you can, I've got an interview with him. You can view it. He used to always say, I'm going to keep preaching till preaching come back in style. That night he called me, I never forget it as long as I live, and we laughed. He said, Frank, so I think preaching is back in style. I think the surface, the fluff, the candy, the cotton candy, that content is going to last. So what are my thoughts about contemplative preaching? That is what I define. I don't know if you've ever listened to a Howard Thurman sermon. I would recommend that to you. I'll give you the name of my favorite Howard Thurman sermon. It's called Charting the Inward Sea. At Boston University, they have a listening library of all the sermons of Howard Thurman. So if you will Google Boston University, Howard Thurman Listening Center, they'll give it to you. You go down and he has a series called The Inner Life. The second sermon is called Charting the Inward Sea. It's the perfect example of a contemplative sermon, where it's contemplation, it's deep, it's thought-provoking. Sometimes you don't get a chance to say amen because you're listening and thinking about what's being said. That's probably on the word gift side. Yes, Charting the Inward Sea by Dr. Howard Thurman. I've heard about prescriptive preaching. I can't elaborate well. That's Howard John Wesley's definition. Howard John Wesley's in a PhD program. So I did an interview with Howard John Wesley. That's on my YouTube channel. You can watch that from him. He'll be talking about prescriptive preaching. That's how he defines his method, because one of the things that I teach in the PhD program is for each student to define their method. so that when, this is why I know that you can ask Gina Stewart about her method and she will respond, because we have trained them. So you can ask Howard John Wesley, what's your method? He's going to say prescriptive preaching, and he's going to define it, because that's part of what we do in the PhD program. What percentage should the minister read the Bible for preparation sermons? I think their personal study are both important. I think my best sermons have always come out of my devotional life. The sermon that Dr. John Guns referenced to was a sermon that I wrote called, Have You Ever Been to God's Face? It's in Genesis 33, and it's up on YouTube too, by the way. And it's Jacob wrestling. And when he walks away with the limp, and he turns and calls the place God's face. I've been to God's face. The name of the sermon, have you ever been to God's face? That sermon got written because for 2 weeks in a row at 3 o'clock in the morning, God woke me up for my devotional life to work on that text. And I worked on it and I worked on it. It was speaking to me. I worked on it. I went and bought a Tanakh, which is a Jewish version of the text. I did research. I did study for 2 whole weeks. The best sermons seem to come, not all the time, but a lot of times, out of the preacher's personal devotional life. When you've lived that and lived with it. I lived with that sermon for 2 weeks. So when you hear that sermon, just know it took me 2 weeks of intense prayer, Bible reading, preparation, thought, and reflection to get that sermon in the shape that it was in, because in some ways I was Jacob wrestling with God. And I walked away from with a limp, but my name got changed. And I look back at the place of my deepest pain and agony and called it God's face. So, yes. The third cohort will probably be 2023. We admit every 3 years. We admitted in January 2020. So our anticipation is we will admit in January 2023. That's my anticipation, which means applications from sometime in 2022 is my guess. We haven't pinned down dates, but that's that. Any other questions or thoughts or reflections? I've enjoyed my time. I've talked 50 minutes. The next Mixed Method Conference, we're planning for September 2021. We did a conference last year we highlighted expository preaching, womanist preaching, and narrative preaching. We showed people 3 different methods of preaching, and then we allowed them to preach a sermon. And so we're going to do that. It's about to pull that together. Advice for preachers who've been preaching less than 5 years: work on the fundamentals. Get a method. What's your method? Whose method connects with you that you can use as a basics from which to proceed, because you got to be grounded somewhere. You improve by preaching the fundamentals, and if you get a method, somebody will. What am I currently reading? I'm reading an article on Christian nationalism about Donald Trump and how the Christian right, it looks like to us that they sold out their birthright they were the moral majority and they would all this stuff, and then Trump comes along and they back him like crazy. And what we're discovering is that they're doing something called Christian nationalism that's open wide enough that a lot of far rights and far right groups and Trump and Christians and evangelicals can all get under the tent and move in one direction, because they're afraid. They see America as this mythic Christian nation. And so they're voting together to return America back. So Trump taps into that and they vote for him regardless of his morals, because they see. So that's the kind of stuff I'm reading. I'm working on an article I'm reading that. Tips for preaching to youth and young adults. Resources: preach universal human experience. If you preach guilt to young people, you preach guilt to old people. What's the experience of those young people in the room? I don't know that we're a lot more alike than we are different. I mean, do young adults wrestle with fear? Do the young adults wrestle with you know, I went and did a revival once time in a retirement village. I was the only thing under 70 in the room, and I was the only thing Black in the room. I did 3 nights, and I was worried that my content was too edgy, you know, and I'm doing, you know, real life stuff. And so nobody said much until we got back to the fellowship hall. And then they told me about that we had been planning retirement for 35 years. And we finally retired and moved down here, beautiful place on the lake. And 2 months after we moved here, he got cancer and he died. And here we are living alone. Well, somebody said, I got kids on drugs. I don't know what to do with my inheritance. You know, they're gonna smoke it or snort. I mean, so in other words, where can you download a copy? I don't want to go into my system and pull it up. And I can't remember the name of it. It's called Making America Christian Again. And it's 3 or 4 authors. It's a sociological study, and they lay out Christian nationalism and why they say, even as we are saying that white Christian America is declining, the narrative that they built will outlast them. So that's off the top of my head the best I can. When does a new preacher begin to feel? I don't know that the nervousness ever subsides. It's a good thing, but you manage it. So I was preaching a installation for one of my daughters in the ministry, and I was going over the message, and I would happen to be tweeting, you know, as we were coming closer to the sermon, and I looked over this, and I said, you know what? I looked over that sermon. This is crap. I mean, this is not going anywhere. I mean, it don't make sense. But I've learned to trust the preparation. So I went with it. So all of us get nervous. It's like, you know, they singing the song right before you preach. You know, you're looking at I look at the manuscript, this is crap. I mean, but I learned to trust the preparation. I trust my preparation. There it is. Somebody posted it. Thank you so much for that. Kimberly Johnston, thank you so much. That's one of my daughters. She teaches at TSU and has a PhD. She's an ordained minister. Yes, that's the article right there, Making America Christian Again, Christian Nationalism and Voting for Donald Trump. There it is. What is a non-religious book that will challenge us spiritually? Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer. It's a great book, Let Your Life Speak by Parker Palmer. I'm gonna take a sip of water.
Dr. Thomas, let me first of all, thank you for today. Amazing. You're probably one of the most thoughtful people I've ever met in ministry. And I appreciate you. You're actually one of my personal mentors and models, believe it or not, in terms of, and of course, I'm a Howard Thurman fanatic. In fact, I try to model and mimic his thought process. I'm probably very far from it, but you know,
me too.
And so I get it. Over the last, I don't know, 30. How many years you've been preaching?
36.
Over the last 36 years, from the moment you begun to now, what is probably the greatest lesson you've learned in your preaching journey? What is the one thing that you have learned over the years that is a staple of who you are?
That no matter how good you get, you never get there. That if I did Howard Thurman, I would say to you, the kind of humility to understand that if you get it right, it's more God than you. if you get it wrong, God offers you more grace than what you think. Because if you ever think it's you, you're getting ready for a crash. So I keep working on my method. I keep getting better. I'm trying to get better. I'm just trying to get better. That's what I'm just trying to get better. So for example, I'll give you, John, you've done Hampton. So, the Hampton Ministers Conference is it's the Super Bowl of Black preaching. It's a tremendous amount of pressure to preach at Hampton. I was invited to be the morning preacher in 2000. And when they ask you and you accept, pressure comes on your shoulder because this is 8,000 or 9,000 preachers. And if you crash and burn, the whole country knows you crash and burn. I mean, it goes out instantly. It ain't like, you can crash and burn over the corner. Nobody know about you crashing on the ground. So it's pressure. So to deflate the pressure, this is what I said. My goal at Hampton, I'm going to preach at home on Sunday, to be a better preacher on Tuesday morning at Hampton than I was on Sunday. To be a better preacher at Wednesday morning I was on Tuesday. To be a better preacher on Thursday. And then when I come back home, to be a better preacher on Sunday than I was on Thursday at Hampton. That I was not going to allow Hampton to define me or to intimidate me, because my real goal is to get better. Though I'll never really get where I want to get, continuous improvement, get better. You work on this for 35 years, a long time. You keep working, you keep working, you keep this. And the reason that you want to get better is to help people. You don't want to get better so you can increase your speaking engagements, and that's all right. So you can be a revivalist and make a name for yourself. You want in that Bible for somebody to come down that aisle saying, "What must I do to be saved?" Tears flowing down their face. You want somebody to give their life. That's why you get better, to help the people. It's not that you can exalt your own name and make a name for yourself and be known as a great preacher. And nothing wrong with that. God can take care of all of that. But John, for me, I just wanted to get better, and humility to know that I never really was going to get there, but I just keep getting better by the grace of God. And if I'm good, God was gracious. If I'm terrible, then I don't have to beat myself up at night. God is more gracious and merciful. Maybe God did some stuff that I don't even know with what was said.
I can sit and listen to you just talk. So I am incredibly appreciative to you. For those of you who are on this Zoom, we have been doing this now, I don't know, Kim, 4 or 5 weeks now, and it's just been an amazing journey. We are always encouraging everyone to cash app our speakers, our presenters. Dr. Thomas does not have a cash app, and so here's how we're going to do today. This is where you got to trust me. If you want to give him something, if you want to sow into him, and we encourage everybody to do so, you can send the cash app to me, and then I will send it through Zelly to him today. So whatever you send to me, I will make sure he knows exactly that he can verify it, and then I will send it directly to him. And yes, buy his books. That's the other thing. This to me, and I'm gonna have 30 seconds of wow. This to me has been one of the most groundbreaking things that's happened through this pandemic. Is Black preachers getting on Zoom at 3:00 on a Sunday and talking about preaching and hearing presentations on preaching and being stretched in the craft. It started with just my ministry, sons and daughters at our church and through our fellowship, Kingdom Fellowship. And we started with like 30, 40 people. And then it just kind of expanded, because the next week I asked Dr. Kimberly Credit, and she came on and was absolutely amazing and absolutely incredible. And then it just kind of went from there. Dr. Jared Carter, and we've just kind of gone. Dr. Greg Howard, and now Dr. Frank Thomas. Next week is Bishop Rudolph McKissick. The following week is Dr. Gina Stewart. So thank you for the commercial. Thank you for the amazing commercial, Dr. Gina Stewart. And then following her would be Dr. William Curtis. And then the plan is to conclude with my brother, Dr. Jeffrey Guns, who will talk about maintaining preaching excellence over 40 years. And so you just hang in. Yes, it is Mother's Day, so go ahead and eat early or eat late, but be on, and others, and you're already sending Cash App. So please send it to me, and I absolutely promise you that I will be sending it directly to him as soon as we are finished. So I thank each and every one of you for getting on. Please, Doc, where can we find your books at? Where are
Amazon.
some of
Amazon, hold on. Yeah, they're on Amazon.
Okay. All right. So please. Okay, so please go to Amazon and look for Dr. Thompson's books. I'm going myself and look, and I have a lot of ministry sons and daughters. I'm going to encourage them now to go look for his stuff. Thank you all for taking time. This is a good hour and 10 minutes to spend in getting better, And I'll say this, the one thing that has happened for those of us who have to preach every week, and I had to preach today, for those of us who had to preach every week, here's the thing we're discovering. If you need an amen to preach, then you're not called to this. You must be called to impacting and empowering and transforming people for the greater good. People are in need of the gospel like never before, but they're also in need of the compassion of the preacher. And so if the purity of the preacher's heart meets the message, then what will happen will be the empowerment of the hearer and a sense of I can face this and I can live in and through this. So thank you so much. Dr. Thomas, you have the last word, and then we will go from here.
I just thank you. One of the missions of the PhD program, John, is to archive, celebrate, write about the genius of African American preaching to generate a preaching renaissance to revive American Christianity. And so your work here in helping people to get better, we don't just work with PhDs and seminary students, we work with everybody, because the only way we're going to have a preaching renaissance is if everybody. And so I want to thank you for your seminary on Sundays. You're contributing, helping people to get better. I think that Black preaching can generate a preaching renaissance in this nation. And so, but it doesn't, you can't just teach one segment. You got to teach everybody. So I commend you for your work and your effort in putting it together. And I enjoy being a part.
Well, you're one of the best there is, and we're honored. And thank you, all of you who are sending your Cash Apps, and we are receiving them. And the moment that we kind of see that that is kind of level off, we will send it to him. And so again, please, everyone, take a moment and send something. If it's nothing but $5, send something to say thank you to him. It's amazing. And so again, it's Bishop JEG, and you can send it to me, and I will get it to him before the day is out. And I promise you, every dollar you send to me will go directly to him. So again, thank you guys so much. You're amazing. You're incredible. And Dr. Frank Thomas, there's only one you, and we're grateful that you're Black and that you're preaching. We love you so much. Everybody be blessed, and we'll see you guys next week for Bishop Rudolph McKissick Jr. Be blessed, everybody.
Thank you. How do I go off?